One of the most common questions I get from writers is about the process for planning and writing scenes. Not the theory of how scenes work, but the actual nuts and bolts of how you take a summary or plan for a scene and write a working version of it. We've all been there. You have this amazing scene in your head, you can see it playing out like a movie, but somehow when you try to actually get it down on paper, it just doesn't work the same way. So in this video, I'm going to break down my exact process. This is the step-by-step approach I use to bridge that gap between I know what needs to happen and I actually wrote a scene that works. Now, my name is Tim Grahl. I'm the CEO of StoryGrid. I'm the author of 6 books. My most recent is the novel The Shithead, which was praised by New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestselling authors. My partner, Sean Coyne, is a writer, editor, and researcher with over 30 years of experience, and everything that I teach in this video and everything at StoryGrid is based on his extensive knowledge and research. Now let's start with step 1. Know your destination. Before I write a single word, I have to know where the scene needs to go. Think about it like this. You wouldn't jump in your car and start driving without knowing where you're headed, right? When I'm working on a novel, each scene has a specific job to do. It needs to move the story forward in a particular way. Maybe the protagonist needs to discover a vital piece of information, or a relationship needs to fundamentally change, or a decision needs to be made that will impact the rest of the story. Here's what I ask myself. What's different by the end of this scene? How does my character change from point A to point B? What absolutely must happen for my story to move forward? What global story value will shift positively or negatively by the end of the scene? I've learned this the hard way. If I start writing before I know these answers, I end up with a wandering scene that doesn't go anywhere. You know the type. Lots of pretty descriptions, some nice dialogue, but nothing really happens. The story doesn't move forward. Now, throughout this video, I'm going to use an example from my book, The Shithead, and specifically, we're going to look at scene 22. If you want to take a look at it, it's down in the description, a link to the PDF so you can read along with this video. But in this scene, scene 22, my protagonist desperately needs to book a next day appointment with an oncologist, and he has to book the appointment that day. And at the end of the scene, he was unable to book the appointment. So that's where my scene needs to go in the broader context of the story. At the beginning, he needs to book an appointment that day. At the end, he wasn't able to book the appointment. So I've got that locked in. That's where I need the scene to go. So now that we know the destination of our scene, that's step 1, we can look at step 2, plan the premise. Now it's time to lay out the basic building blocks of your scene, and there are 4 of them, 4 crucial elements of the premise that you have to know before you start writing. The first is status quo. What happened before this scene? This might seem obvious, but it's critical. What happened before this scene started? Your characters don't just materialize out of thin air when your scene begins. They're coming from somewhere, carrying the baggage of the previous events, and expecting things to unfold in a certain way. I always ask myself, what just happened to my protagonist? What are they thinking about? And what do they expect to happen next? The status quo is all about your protagonist assumes they know what's going to happen next. That's the status quo. So that's the first step. The second is the setting. This isn't just about picking a random location. I need to know, where exactly is this scene taking place? What time of day is it? What's the atmosphere? The setting often influences how the scene unfolds. A conversation in a crowded coffee shop plays out very differently than one in an empty parking lot at midnight. So that's the first 2 steps of the premise. We've got the status quo and the setting. Now let's look at the protagonist. This is the outputter of this scene. This is the character whose life is knocked off balance by the inciting incident. The protagonist is the person you want your reader to empathize with during this scene. Everything that happens we experience through their perspective. Remember, the global protagonist is not always the in-scene protagonist. This can change from scene to scene, so you have to be really clear on whose life is getting knocked off balance by the inciting incident and who makes a climactic choice of this scene. That is the protagonist. Which leads to the 4th step of the premise, which is the inciting incident. This is where the fun begins. The inciting incident is the unexpected event that's going to knock your protagonist's life off balance. It's what kicks your scene into gear. Your protagonist walks into the scene expecting things to go a certain way, that's the status quo, and the inciting incident is what messes up all of those expectations. Here's a tip I learned the hard way. If you're struggling to identify your inciting incident, you probably don't have one. And without an inciting incident, your scene will feel flat. Just a series of things happening with no real tension or forward momentum. So that's the four things that make up the premise of your scene. So if we're looking at scene 22 from my book, The Shithead, the status quo at the beginning of the scene is that the protagonist has lied to an IRS agent saying he has an oncologist appointment and therefore can't make the mandated in-person meeting. So he's got this appointment he lied about to get out of a meeting with the IRS. That's the status quo, and he's assuming that's going to work. He's not going to have to go to the meeting. The setting begins in his co-working space at his office and then moves him through visiting several different oncology offices in person. The protagonist is Eric, the global protagonist, who is also the protagonist of this scene. And then the inciting incident is when the IRS agent leaves a voicemail that they will need to confirm from the oncology office the appointment in order to miss the meeting. So this is what knocks Eric's life off balance. He didn't actually have an appointment. He said he did, so now he's got to go get one so that he doesn't actually have to go to that IRS meeting. So at this point, we've done step one. We know the destination of the scene, where we have to get in the scene. Then we did step two. We figured out the premise, basically the start of the scene, everything we need to know to start the scene. And step three is plan the crisis and the climax. Your crisis and climax determine whether your scene works or falls flat. In your crisis, you have to have very strong and balanced stakes. You have to have something that has really strong pros and cons for your character. This is what creates the crisis. And stakes aren't just about making things bigger or more intense. They're about the specific consequences riding on your protagonist's crisis decision. And there are three ways to develop stakes in your scene. The first is time. How much time does your protagonist have to make their decision? The less time they have, the more pressure they're under. The second is degree. This is about how significant the consequences are. What exactly will your protagonist gain or lose based on their choice? A character choosing between two lunch options isn't very compelling, but a character choosing between saving their marriage or advancing their career, now we're interested. And the third is kind. What types of stakes are we dealing with? Is it physical survival, moral integrity, professional success, or love? Different types of stakes create different types of pressure on your protagonist. And this is all about the crisis, because the crisis is where your protagonist faces a difficult decision between two irreconcilable options. They can only pick one. And each option should have clear stakes attached to it, what they stand to gain and lose either way. The key is that there can't be an easy answer. Both options need to cost your protagonist something they value. This is what gets the reader to actually care about your character in the terrible situation they're in. Now that's the crisis, the choice between A and B that both have very intense stakes, which leads to the climax. This is where your protagonist acts on their crisis choice. Whatever they decide, it needs to have real, meaningful consequences that change the situation. Here's my rule of thumb. If my protagonist can make a choice that returns everything to normal, my stakes aren't strong enough. So in scene 22 of The Shithead, I want the reader to experience how far the protagonist will go to get what he wants. He is trying to get an appointment at an oncology office without breaking the social and legal boundaries. I decided to push it to the point that involves bribery and a physical attack. This makes the tension and energy of the scene so much higher. So at this point, we've got a really good roadmap for our scene. We know where we're starting, we've got the premise, and then we know the climax of the scene, what's going to happen at the climax. And now we're on to step 4, write the draft. Here's where the magic happens. We turn all of that planning into an actual scene. But here's what I've learned about drafting. Your plan is a roadmap, not a prison. Think of all of those elements that we planned, the status quo, inciting incident, crisis, and climax, as waypoints on a journey. You know you need to hit them, but there are countless interesting paths you can take between them. This is where I let my creativity flow. I might discover a perfect bit of dialogue I hadn't planned, a surprising reaction from my protagonist, a detail about the setting that increases the tension, a secondary character who suddenly becomes important. The key is maintaining that balance between structure and surprise. Your planned elements keep you on track, but don't let them strangle out your creativity. Here's how I approach it. I know where my scene starts, the status quo. I know what disrupts it, the inciting incident. I know where it needs to end up at the crisis and climax. Everything else, that's where the fun begins. Sometimes my characters surprise me, sometimes the perfect metaphor appears out of nowhere, sometimes a scene takes an unexpected turn that makes it even better than what I planned. That's okay as long as I hit those crucial waypoints I planned out. I can let the writing take me on some interesting detours along the way. Think of it like a road trip. You know you need to get from New York to Los Angeles, and you know you need to stop in Chicago and Denver. But if you spot an interesting diner along the way or discover a scenic route between stops, go for it. This is the whole point of planning out the scenes in a longer piece of fiction, because your scene does have to get from point A to point B to make the whole macro story work. So as long as you have those things planned out, then you can write freely from point to point. Now, of course, this is hard to show you the example of the shithead, but if you want to watch my actual process of writing a scene, I did a video on that. It's linked down in the description and I'll pop it up at the end of this video. So at this point, we've planned out everything for the scene and then we've written a draft. And now we can go on to step 5, which is analyze, edit, and move on. Here's where I put on my editor's hat and make sure my scene is actually working. It's not enough for the scene to feel good. I need to know it's doing its job. So first, I check the object of desire to make sure there's a clear object of desire that the protagonist is actively pursuing throughout the scene. Then I check all 5 commandments of storytelling: inciting incident, turning point, crisis, climax, and resolution. I make sure they're present and working. If any of these elements are missing or weak or not connected, that's my first priority to fix. But once I know the foundational structure is solid, I look for ways to make the scene better. Can I heighten the emotion in a key moment? Is my dialogue doing enough work? Are there opportunities for better metaphors or description? Could I improve the pacing? Are there any unnecessary parts that I could cut? Am I telling when I should be showing? And here's a tip I've learned. This analysis works best if you can look at your scene with some fresh eyes. That's why I like to let the scene rest for at least a day before I dive in to analyze it and do any edits. When I try to analyze right after writing, I'm just too close to it. I see what I meant to write rather than what I actually wrote. Now, once I've done my analysis and made my edits the next day, I move on to the next scene. And I mean really move on. I don't go back and tinker, I don't keep polishing, I don't second guess my choices. The scene is done until I finish the first draft of the entire story. Why? Because 2 things will kill your momentum. 1, getting stuck in an endless loop of editing one scene, and 2, trying to make each scene perfect before moving forward. Here's the thing. Your story will shift and evolve as you write it. Characters will surprise you, new connections will emerge, you might find something you need to go back and set up earlier. It's like putting together an IKEA chest of drawers. You don't tighten down every screw as you put it in. First, you get all the screws in loosely, then, when it's all put together, you go and tighten everything down. It's the same with your scenes. Make sure they're working, solid structure, clear stakes, meaningful choices, but don't try to make them publishable yet. Get your whole story assembled first, then go back and tighten everything up during revision. Trust the process, do your analysis, make your edits, then keep moving forward. You'll be amazed at how much better your story flows when you're not constantly looking backwards. So that's my exact process for writing scenes that work. I have to pick my destination, then I figure out the premise, and then I figure out where the scene has to go with the crisis and the climax. Then I write the draft, then I analyze, edit, and I move on. But here's the thing. Reading about a process is one thing, actually implementing it with expert guidance and feedback is another. That's why I want to invite you to join our next scene writing workshop. In just 6 weeks, you'll get weekly live training and group workshopping, one-on-one expert feedback on your scenes, daily group exercises, a supportive community of writers, and most importantly, real improvement in your writing. Plus, I'm so confident in this workshop because we've offered it to hundreds of students that if you submit your scenes each week and don't see significant improvement in your writing by the end, we'll give you a full refund. So I highly recommend you join us for the next workshop. You can go to storygrid.com/workshop to see more about that and fill out an application today. Now, if you want to keep taking what you learned in this video and go even deeper, I have that video I mentioned about watching me write a scene live. That's going to be on your screen right now, so click that and keep learning. But either way, thanks for being a writer. Thanks for being a part of our community here at StoryGrid, and I'll see you next time.